Hello and welcome to New Economic Thinking. I'm here today with Cameron Hepburn, who is the Director for Economic Sustainability at INET at Oxford. Cameron, thanks for joining me this morning.
My pleasure.
You wrote a piece a little while ago where you described the 20th century as a great economic success story for the West, a huge rise in quantum living standards. So, of course, the retort comes from places like India and China. Why aren't we allowed to pollute our way to prosperity the way they did in the West?
Well, I don't think they want to pollute their way to prosperity if they think about the challenges carefully enough.
No, but they don't want. I was clearly being facetious, but clearly they do want to be given the same outlets to growth, shall we say?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They ought to grow. They will grow, whether the West likes it or not. And part of that's obviously catch-up growth and the transfer of technologies and ideas across from the West to China and to India and to Africa, one hopes. Part of it is simply joining the global community. But there's no stopping that growth process. And I don't think environmental limitations such as they are today will stop that growth process in the short or medium run.
I think the complaint was, of course, when China and India were, for example, reluctant to embrace the Kyoto protocols. In fairness, so was the United States. That was the implicit argument that you are putting barriers in front of our growth that you didn't face several decades ago.
No, precisely. I understand the argument. I think, frankly, the world has changed since then, and the Chinese in particular recognize that if their growth is going to be sustainable, and if it's going to be of a quality and a type that they actually want, this is to go back to my first point really, they need to do it in a different way to the way we did it in the West. And if you look at China's lead already in many emerging renewable energy technologies and other clean technologies.
In fact, they're spending more on energy technologies, clean tech, than the United States is, for example.
Precisely, yeah. So I think that point is, it's not understood everywhere and always, but in certain key locations, it's understood that for this growth process and this catch-up growth to be successful and in their own interests, it needs to look a bit different to the growth processes that we've had, in the 1900s in the West. And there's some exciting things going on in that part of the world. You will have heard of probably the Under the Dome film that's had a couple of 100 million views that deals with Chinese air pollution, which of course had a lot of state support, at least initially. And so as China has become richer, inevitably the demand for a cleaner environment has grown stronger. So it's basic economic processes. And that demand is now at a point where we are seeing a response from policymakers and from the government necessarily to maintain kind of political stability, frankly. So this is an important issue. It's been an important issue, certainly for China, for at least the last 5 or 10 years, and it's only growing in importance. So I think we will see a very different style of growth, whether it's Li Keqiang's new normal with a green tinge, and whether it's as stable as the Chinese would like it to be, time will tell. But it's certainly they're shifting the economy as we speak.
Let's take a little bit take a step back and look at that question of economic sustainability, because there is an implication that the environment or concern about the environment actually places limits on growth. At least historically, that's the way we've looked at it, that it's considered to be a trade-off. But there are a number of scholars. I was chatting to Michael Grubb recently, and he pointed out that you can embrace a new economic growth paradigm by embracing a new kind of green economy. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, you're right. There's a long and very interesting tradition of economic scholars thinking about this, from John Stuart Mill in Principle of Political Economy in 1848, talked about the necessity of approaching a stationary state of capital and population, and us having to then focus on other forms of human improvement and the art of living, as Mill termed it, and Keynes in Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, pushed a similar line that we need to be accepting that to some degree the economic problem of material wants rather than status wants can and ought to be solved, so we can be focusing on other things and stopping the cessation and the focus on growth per se. Now, I think you have to think very carefully about these issues and get your ideas quite straight. The first point is that we don't really face, there's no evidence in the data that we face serious limits on our growth from material limitations. So whether it's tin or copper or even energy sources, there's vast amounts of coal, there's still a lot of oil and gas. We just saw a discovery of new reserves in England, of all places, southern England, 100 billion barrels potentially.
So you don't subscribe to the Malthusian notion that there are resource limits which would limit that growth?
No, I mean, it is obviously kind of mathematically true, as you often hear said, especially by physical scientists, that on a finite planet you can't have infinite growth, but we're nowhere near to infinite growth, and we're not close to bumping up against those limits. And one of the reasons is that it's very simple economics. We've got a price mechanism in markets for many of these commodities that works fairly well, and as if you do bump up against short-term constraints, the price goes up, and there are economic effects, but it also curbs consumption, triggers innovation, triggers new exploration, etc. So I'm not personally particularly worried about peak oil or peak this or peak that on the commodities side. What I think economists ought to be worried about, and environmentalists ought to be worried about, is the forms of natural capital, which actually includes all the oil, coal, and gas, but the other forms of natural capital like biodiversity, like climate stability, where we don't have price mechanisms in place, where we do have quite serious limits on what we can do. So, in the climate case, we've got, roughly speaking, a total of 1 trillion gigatons of carbon that we can put up into the atmosphere. We're well over halfway there, and we're going to breach that limit within several decades. So
and the implications of that when that happens?
The implications of that is that we commit ourselves to going well above 2 degrees increase of mean temperatures, which means a much greater increase in temperatures towards the poles and a much greater increase on land as opposed to on sea, and the implications of that are changed weather patterns, challenges to food supply, challenges to water, etc. And whether you're stabilizing or hoping to stabilize the Earth's temperature, mean temperature at 2 degrees above where it was before the Industrial Revolution, or 3 degrees or 4 degrees, which would be extremely dangerous, we need to transition to an economy where there is no net emissions of carbon.
And what do you think is the tipping point going to be for that? The reason I ask is the governor of the Reserve Bank of India, Raghuram Rajan, talked about he talked about the environment, but he also talked about it as the equivalent of a financial crisis, and said, we were heading towards a precipice. And in fact, when it came to the financial crisis of 2008, we effectively went off the precipice. You could make the case that we are hovering at that precipice right now as far as the environment goes. In fact, some people would say we've already gone over it, and there's been repeated signs of it, the water crisis in California, Hurricane Sandy, droughts in Australia, and yet the political response is still maddeningly slow. I mean, what's it going to take? Will it take some sort of a calamity of Noah's Ark-like proportions before we do anything about it?
Sadly, not even that might work, it seems. That's what we learn from psychologists, that while these big events do have an effect, they also trigger a kind of an avoidance response where, collectively we prefer not to think about it or prefer to focus on other things. So I wouldn't necessarily hang our hat on a big catastrophe triggering a proper and sensible response, although crises obviously can help. I mean, I think
so much for Homo economicus acting as a rational, self-interested, utility-maximizing agent.
Simplifications are useful and dangerous, aren't they? But nonetheless often useful. But yes, quite right. So what we've been doing at INET Oxford is to think about the problem using some new tools, new economic thinking, bringing in some other disciplines to bear, which is actually very natural in the environmental space, because if you're working on biodiversity, you're working with ecologists and zoologists and evolutionary biologists, and if you're working on climate science and climate economics, you're naturally talking to atmospheric physicists and so on. And so our thinking here is that there are a number of levers that are particularly important. One of them has to be technology. So without kind of going purely down a techno-optimist route, it is undeniably true that if the cleaner technologies were cheaper than the dirtier technologies right now, then the political problem either wouldn't exist or would be significantly less serious than it is at the moment. So work on innovation and work on thinking really carefully about research and development and deployment and how much they contribute to reducing the costs of clean energy looks to us to be very important, and we've got a very talented group of scholars thinking about those sorts of issues. And the other thing and then many other things, but one other thing that is important on the political side is, this conference in particular has stressed just how poorly we are allocating capital across a range of different areas. And I think it's fair to say that in the environment that's particularly true. So we spend, until the oil crisis, we were spending roughly $500 billion a year subsidizing fossil fuel consumption. We're spending roughly $500 billion, a bit more a year, on the exploration and production of more fossil fuels, despite the fact that we've got many times more in reserves and even more in resources than we can ever afford to burn. So this is almost an insane waste of $1 trillion when we spend only a few $100 billion on clean energy.
Well, as you say, the pricing signals seem to be all messed up, and we are giving lots of subsidies to traditional energy forms rather than others. Of course, there is an argument that says that when you give someone a cheap good and you make it more expensive, politically it's very hard to do. And then there is also the issue, which we've been discussing a lot recently, of inequality, that generally if you implement, say, something like a carbon tax to send out the right pricing signal, and economists will say this is absolutely the right thing to do. But of course, someone at a lower income level is going to have a much more difficult time dealing with that than someone who's making $1 million a year. So what's the right way to cope with that problem?
So it is a problem, yes. It's not an insurmountable problem. The first thing to say is that in very poor countries, carbon pricing doesn't in fact hurt the poor because they're not even emitting very much, so they're not affected too much by it. But in most richer, developed economies, you're exactly right, there are inequality issues, and carbon pricing without other measures ends up having regressive effects. But take the Australian emissions trading scheme, now dead, sadly, but in its design, the civil servants and the economists working on it, and I was talking with them closely at the time, managed to design a scheme that left 90% of the population better off, and it was the bottom 9 deciles. So effectively it was the top 10% who paid for the emissions trading scheme. Now, whether that's correlated with the fact that it's now dead or not, I don't know, but it's certainly not. It's false to think about carbon pricing in isolation from all of the other policies that are going to go along. My
understanding, though, was that the carbon pricing, the carbon emissions trading system was somewhat ineffective, at least in Europe. I'm not sure about the Australian case, but because the thresholds were set too high under lobbying, for example, from Germany's heavy industries, which is ironic considering the government's so anti-nuclear power for the same environmental grounds.
Yeah, so there are a lot of things to unpack there. So in the first phase of emissions trading in Europe, which ran from 2005 to the end of 2007, there was definitely massive over-allocation of permits to industry by the European nation states. It was called a learning phase by the European Commission, and it's probably a good thing they branded it that way because there were some obvious lessons. The price crashed to zero. But it nonetheless triggered some abatement. So in the next phase, the second phase, we're now in the third phase. Second phase from 2008 to 2012 suffered from the effects of the financial crisis. There was still some over-allocation, but it's been improved over time. And we're now in a situation looking forwards to 2020 and 2030 where prices are most likely too low. They're between 5 and 10 euros per tonne of carbon dioxide, and that's probably not high enough, certainly not high enough to be triggering some of the long-term structural changes that we need, bearing in mind that by 2050 or around about, we need to be zero net emissions. We may not be, but if we want to manage risks in a reasonably sensible way, that's where we want to be.
And is that a sufficient threshold to prevent the doomsday scenario that you sketched earlier?
Well, there's a lot that is uncertain in climate science, and I don't think you'll find a proper climate scientist or economist who'll tell you otherwise. It's
because some actually say that we're already there. Actually, that we're already at the trigger point where we're losing this battle.
Yeah, well, there are certainly some indications that are fairly negative, whether it's Antarctic ice breaking away, the Siberian methane craters that we're seeing, events in the Arctic as well. So I mean, there are a lot of kind of canary in the mine shaft moments. Hopefully, what we're not seeing yet is any irreversible change, although some of them may be. But look, if you're thinking about this as an economist, you're balancing risks, you're balancing probabilities, and sometimes you don't exactly have probabilities on things.
And how do you balance them? The reason I ask is that many of these negative externalities, as economists like to call them, are not priced accurately in the sense that, I mean, just to give one example, carbon emissions. There is a group of people, advocates of nuclear power, who say that once you actually got the plant up and running, leaving aside the cost of building a nuclear plant, which are substantial, that you have relatively low carbon emissions. It's a vastly superior alternative to coal, for example. But at the same time, when you do have the contingent externality of a Fukushima type event, then clearly that changes the calculations considerably. So how do you price that adequately?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, one of the challenges here, of course, is that despite the very high-profile accidents that nuclear plants occasionally have, it's a much, much safer technology than coal, just on the numbers.
Yes.
So I'm not advocating nuclear or not, but just factually, coal kills many, many people every year that just don't make the press, whether it's in mining, whether it's in the whole supply chain.
Well, it also happens over a longer period. I mean, people die of lung cancer.
Exactly, quite. So it happens at the other end with particulate matter and respiratory problems. So nuclear gets, objectively speaking, a very unfair rap. And in fact, it's one of the safest generating technologies around. But it's also quite expensive. And the costs of nuclear, if anything, they haven't been coming down. They've been broadly flat, possibly mildly increasing. You compare that to solar, which, as we all know, has been rocketing down, not just in the last few years. It's been coming down for a couple of decades, very reliably, year on year.
A large part of that being, the massive state involvement by the Chinese, which has acted
recently
in a way that the state should act in many respects. The loss leader driving down input costs to make a technology diffusion more readily available to the population. Something, ironically, that the Americans are criticizing them for.
Yeah, there is some irony there. And that's right. The Chinese scale-up of solar has been it's been very remarkable. But it's not the only mechanism that has been driving the cost down. They've been coming down, as I say, for year on year for a long time at a very fast rate, faster than any other technology. So you take coal over 100 years, and it's basically a flat line, a bit of up and down here and there. Nuclear, it's a mild increase. Solar, it's a crash. And so one of the challenges on the tech side is to say, A, how do we continue those cost decreases and make sure they don't level off? And there's fantastic work going on in labs around the world now on nth generation solar that's extremely exciting, embedded in glass, embedded in materials, etc. And the other question is, how do we manage to integrate solar and other renewables into our grid systems in a reliable way? We're not bumping up against these problems yet because at most you're talking 30% penetration in Germany on a sunny day. But once you're up to 70, 50, 60, 70% penetration of renewables, you've got a big grid balancing problem because the sun doesn't shine all the time, it's not always windy, etc. You may not have enough hydro to balance the grid if you don't have the interconnectors. Now, all of these problems should be technically solvable, but working out exactly how to solve them physically, technically, as well as economically and socially are quite, they're good, meaty problems that, again, INET Oxford is working on.
And lastly, I'd like to ask you, what do you actually mean when you talk about economic sustainability? What does that phrase connote for you?
Well, sustainability is one of those terms, isn't it? That it kind of worked initially because it meant everything to everyone, and then it kind of lost some of its power precisely for the same reasons. It's a bit too vague. So, I mean, in our context, what we're really thinking about is the sustainability of our economic systems, which, to my mind, means sustainable increases in human prosperity. So, not absolutely year on year every year, but a continuation of the improvements that we've seen over the last century, coupled with, from an environmental point of view, the protection of the key components of our natural capital that provide us with the basis for our civilization. And that ranges, obviously, from climate stability and biodiversity protection for our food systems, but through to other elements of natural capital. So it's not a crisp soundbite of an answer, but it's sustainable economic prosperity with environmental protection. Yeah.
Actually, that could be put on a bumper sticker.
I'm not sure about that.
Cameron Hepburn, thank you very much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.